Good morning, and welcome back to our course on Mary Cassatt. I'm Jasmine Hagens, Curator of Lectures, Courses, and Concerts. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's talk, The Art of Thinking, Mary Cassatt, 1880 to 1900, presented by Dr. Nancy Mowll Mathews. Dr. Mathews recently retired as the Eugénie Prendergast Senior Curator of 19th and 20th Century Art at the Williams College Museum of Art, and is currently visiting associate professor at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. Of the many books and exhibitions she has produced, the best known are Cassatt and Her Circle, Selected Letters, Cassatt, The Color Prints, and Mary Cassatt, A Life. Mathews received her PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University and was at Williams College from 1984 to 2012. In addition to her work on Cassatt, she is the co-author of the Prendergast Catalogue Raisonné and numerous other books on Maurice and Charles Prendergast, Paul Gauguin, and the relationship between art and early film. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mathews.
Thank you, Jasmine. That was great, and thank you for inviting me. I'm really grateful to be here. And here today has got to be one of the ugliest days ever, right? And look what we get to do today. So, all is well in the universe. I was just talking to Erica, and I want to thank Erica too for including me in this course. Erica and I have been working on Cassatt together for many, many years, and we, as well as other artists, Erica on Sargent and me on the Prendergast brothers, and we were saying how grateful we are when we get a chance to look at these artists that we've worked on for so many years in a slightly different way. And that's what happened when I was invited to do this particular period of Mary Cassatt's work. I also, in addition to being invited to talk about that period, I have been working on an exhibition of Mary Cassatt for a museum in Paris. Some of you will be familiar with it, but it's a pretty small museum. It's called the Jacquemart-André. And it's a little bit like the Frick in that it's a 19th century mega millionaire's collection house. And they're doing an exhibition of Mary Cassatt in 2018, and they asked me to curate it. And when I was putting together the works that I thought we could reasonably get, and anybody who's been involved in putting together exhibitions knows that that's pretty tricky. And when I put them all together, what really popped out at me about Cassatt's work was how each one of those figures, and they're mostly figures. You know, Mary Cassatt didn't do landscapes as a rule. She didn't do still lives. She didn't do crowd scenes. She mostly did one or two figures. And what is unusual about them is the quality of thought that comes through when you look at these faces. And I'm showing you one that is particularly thoughtful in this first slide. And this was a quality that was talked about and written about at the time, during her lifetime. And I'm showing you a quote here from an American journalist, Eleanor Caldwell, who was writing in conjunction with Mary Cassatt's first American exhibition, which was in 1895. And it was in some ways a reprise of an exhibition, a retrospective exhibition that she had had 2 years earlier in Paris. So this article is a revision, bringing back to life some of what was written about that previous exhibition. And she adds her own response to Mary Cassatt's work, and particularly one painting. She says, "The face was so exquisite in tone and so refined in sentiment. She looked thinking." And it made me wonder, what does an artist have to do to make their subjects look like they're thinking, or look thinking, not even look like they're thinking, look thinking. So today, I invite you to come with me on a journey to think about thinking. Now, paradoxically, we're going to start out not so much with thinking, but with looking. And here is something that you're totally familiar with. There are probably people in the audience here who have, on a daily basis, looked at this painting and talked about this painting, and particularly the idea of looking. I mean, here's a woman at the opera in a loge with opera glasses, and she's so entirely rapt by what she's looking at. She could not be paying attention to anything else in the entire world except what she sees through those opera glasses. And in a way, and you probably have talked about this as well, it's a bit of a self-portrait, or you might say portrait of an artist, in that what artists do, and particularly what Mary Cassatt did and what her colleagues did, was put the emphasis on looking. And even the photograph that I'm showing you here of Mary Cassatt, she has that very direct gaze. You can see her being the woman in the loge. We don't know that it's a self-portrait, but it's so similar to her in that attention that she pays to what's around her. And it's with not just her face and with the opera glasses, but it's with her whole body. And I know you know the whole painting. In comparison, the photograph doesn't convey nearly as much of that sense of rapt attention, of being totally engaged. And this is my own phrase. I believe that photography, particularly portrait photography, was a little bit like kryptonite, in that you put a camera in front of somebody and they're like gone. You know, you panic. It's a deer in headlights situation, right? I mean, a camera, a video camera, you know, somebody points it at you and says, smile, and you're like, gone. Who you are is almost impossible to call up at that particular moment. So I wonder if Cassatt thought about portraiture in general in this way. And I'm showing you here two portraits that she did of her mother. The one on the left from 1873 is before she gets involved with the Impressionist group. She comes out of a romantic background, that is Romanticism. That's what she was trained in. She studied with Thomas Couture. She admired, for instance, the work of Millet and Corot, all the Barbizon painters. And it's a lovely portrait of her mother, who was a very beautiful, lovely woman. But compared to Le Figaro, the second portrait of her mother, it doesn't give us nearly the sense of a woman who is actively engaged in the world, in life, in thinking. And what she's doing, of course, is now reading. She's using her eyes. She's absorbing the world through sight, through looking, and it is a chain reaction to all of the thoughts that are going on in her head because of this act of looking. So it's not a surprise that Cassatt, who her friends, her mother, told her many times that she should become a portraitist because she had such a talent for likenesses, which is what she said. And Mary Cassatt, although she did portraits, she was like, no, portraits are not it for me. There's not enough in portraits. for me. I want to paint paintings, quote unquote, the big works, the monumental works. I want to make a contribution. I want to make a statement. And fortunately, she found the Impressionists, who helped put this impulse into context. And I'm just reviewing for you what Impressionism was about: Impressionism, realism, and the act of seeing. And I'm quoting here from Wikipedia, which I heartily recommend. I don't know why people don't like it. I love it. I use it constantly. The articles are well written. They're based on good research, and I couldn't say it better myself. So, visual perception. In Wikipedia, there's no looking or seeing, it's visual perception. Visual perception is the ability to interpret, and this is in bold, although I don't know if you can see that, the surrounding environment by processing information that is contained in visible light. Okay, 3 key words for Impressionism: interpretation, environment, and light. We could not see anything if there were no light. Seeing is light coming through our eyes. And what's important about this is that this is within a realist philosophy. And realism, in philosophical terms, means that you believe, it's a philosophical construct, that what you see out there, the visible world, as this says, realism asserts the mind-independent existence of a visible world. So what's the opposite of that? The opposite of that is that there is no world. What we see, we're making up in our minds. And the name for that philosophical school is idealism. That nothing, really, our senses are lying to, our senses only exist in our minds. There is no outer world. Realism posits a mind-independent world, that if we were gone tomorrow, and this is the thing about, the tree falling in the forest, if no one sees it, does it exist? Is it there? These two philosophical schools are opposite one another, and we'll actually get to both. But in terms of realism, this idea that the visible world is an independent entity and that it is important for us to explore it. Every new observation brings us closer to understanding reality, being able to live with this external world in a knowing and planning and understanding and comfortable way. So this is the philosophical construct of French realism in literature and in art, and Impressionism that grows out of it with that emphasis on the outside world. We see through visible light. So, not only is this current thought in the 19th century, but it engages with current technology that not only philosophers and artists and writers are interested in exploring the outside world, but scientists are too. And mainly how we get information from light, and how we can get more observations and a greater understanding of reality by simply seeing more. So although lenses are an ancient technology, you can see I have here the Nimrud lens, which is the oldest known lens down here, around 750 BCE. Lenses were glasses. Eyeglasses were developed in the medieval period. Telescopes, microscopes, all of those had been invented in previous centuries. These opera glasses that she has are not not extraordinarily modern technology. But as the 19th century went on, lenses got better and better, eyeglasses got better and better, bifocals, for instance, lenses for astigmatism, all of this was the subject of scientific and technological advance. In addition to lenses that improve sight, human sight, there are the other technological advances. For instance, gas lights, which illuminate these grand theaters in the 19th century. Plate glass, inexpensive processes of plate glass that are responsible really for the way Paris looks today, because Paris happened to be rebuilt after the Franco-Prussian War with this inexpensive plate glass. So you have French doors. We still call them French doors. You have huge windows. And in addition to that, along with plate glass windows, are plate glass mirrors that can all let in more light. So not only can you see better because of the lenses, there is simply more that you can see because there is just plain more light. And this is celebrated by the Impressionists. I'm just showing you here a few works that were in the first Impressionist exhibition that Mary Cassatt exhibited in, which was the fourth, and it was in 1879. But you can see this is like a, an essay on light in the 19th century. The windows in Degas' work, the mirror down here, the lenses in the telescope, and of course back here, the big gas lights in the theaters. It is all about light. And some of you will recognize the friend of Degas and friend of the Impressionists, Edmond Duranty, who talks about this in his essay called The New Painting, which he published in 1876. He says, "Light reflects both the ensemble of all the rays and the color of the vault which covers the earth. Now, indeed, for the first time, painters have understood and reproduced or tried to reproduce these phenomena. In some of their canvases, we can feel light and heat vibrate and palpitate." I love that. "We feel an intoxication of light, which for painters educated outside of and in opposition to nature is a thing without merit, without importance, much too bright, too clear, too crude, and too explicit." So, all about light, all about how much more we can see, all about how new observations can help us understand reality. Now, theories of sight, just as a review, and there will be a quiz. This is a course, after all, right? So if you don't have questions at the end of this, quiz, okay? So get your questions ready. Just reviewing that Euclid, Ptolemy, etc., believed that sight had to do with rays emanating from the eyes and hitting outside objects. Then, of course, but even in Greek times, there were those who said, no, the rays are coming from the object to the eye. And Isaac Newton, most importantly, established the idea of the rays. And there were, for centuries after that, all kinds of explorations into what those rays were. Were they light waves? Now, quantum theory says no, they're sort of independent pulses of energy. But the idea that it's the eye that is receiving these rays was continually experimented in the 19th century. But finally, and most importantly, in these theories of vision, of sight, is unconscious inference, which is a term that was developed by Hermann von Helmholtz, one of the great scientists of the 19th century, in his treatise on physiological optics from 1867. So this is all new. This is when we talk about Impressionists wanting to celebrate the modern age. This is all about what was happening at the time. And of course, what it says, what Helmholtz said was, our eyes are not that great, compared to lenses, compared to all kinds of optical devices. Our eyes are not really getting all the information that they could. And that's supplemented by a matter of making assumptions and conclusions from incomplete data based on previous experiences. That seeing is all about the mind, filling in, making assumptions, bringing in from experience to interpret, to put the pieces together of what we're looking at. So given that sight is individual, that is based on our experiences, based on our assumptions, based on what we bring to the table in terms of understanding reality, we're going to look back at Mary Cassatt's images of looking and see how differently she interpreted these. And these two, which were in the Impressionist exhibition of 1879, are two entirely different ways of seeing. One I'm calling looking, which is getting as much information as possible, even with lenses, outside lenses, and seeing, which is just a general category, not focusing on anything in particular. Wouldn't you agree that the way these two have been developed in terms of not just what they're doing with their eyes, although that has a lot to do with it, but the pose of the figure, how alert they seem, or not alert. And I'd like to propose that, in fact, it has to do with that theory that I have about her and portraiture, that in your painting, in the MFA painting, the woman who is looking through the binoculars is also at the same time being observed by somebody else in the theater. In this case, these women, if you put these two paintings side by side, look like they're looking at this woman. And she, this one, to me, looks like she knows she's being looked at. She has that deer in the headlights look of portraiture. Because she's being looked at, doesn't know where to look. That sense of she's looking, she's seeing, her eyes are open, but not focused on anything. There's a whole psychological state that seems to go along with just the way sight is constructed in that work. And completely differently in these. These are women who are actually out there looking, and she has absolutely no response to somebody looking at her. Completely absorbed in her own looking. So seeing, looking, and I'm adding a third one, observing, which is what I would call what the women are doing in yet another one of your works, The Tea. These are, just to define them, three different ways of seeing: to look, to turn one's eyes towards something in order to see, looking, just gathering information; seeing, which is just a general category, your eyes are open, but you're not doing anything with them in particular; and observing, which is a whole different category, because it means that you are looking at something with attention, but particularly to see or learn something, or to judge, to discern, to make categories, to to draw conclusions. And when you look at the women in Mary Cassatt's tea paintings, yours is one, I'm showing you just a couple of others. These are people who are looking at something, presumably at somebody else in the room. This is a tea party, after all. These are people who have been brought together, some from the outside and some from the inside. This is not a family. This is not a family meal. This is a social event. And we know that because some are wearing hats and some are not. If you're in your own house, you are not wearing a hat. But if you are receiving company, like this woman is, this is her home, she's not going outside, but she is receiving company, so she has this lace veil on. This woman is coming in from the outside, this woman is coming in from the outside, and they're there's something going on. They're talking, they're gossiping, they're acting out. And don't you wonder what they're thinking? Particularly this woman. There's something about that, like rolling her eyes kind of look. She's like, did she really say that? Is that, oh my God, is she going out with so-and-so? The thoughts going through her mind are very subtly, just like you're in a social situation, you don't want to offend anybody, but you're like, really? Did they really say that? I mean, this one too, kind of skeptical, and that's her home. She's without the hat, so she lives there. Even our very distinguished elderly woman, Mrs. Riddle, at the tea table, she's serving tea. Perhaps the younger people are gabbing or making noise, and she's like, really? Let's act dignified here. This one seems, not so skeptical as that one. A little bit of a smile on her face. But again, they're observing, they're looking, they're judging, they're concluding, they're processing. This is a whole spectrum of responses, looking and thinking. And it establishes it within the Impressionist concept of series. And we're thinking, and we are used to Impressionist series, the most well-known, most famous, of course, would be the Monet series. Think of the Haystacks, for instance, or the Rouen Cathedral series, where you're looking at basically the same thing, but in different light. I would propose, it's a bit of a stretch, but in that looking is based on light, that these different interpretations are based on different circumstances of light, of seeing, of thinking, of being. So, speaking of Impressionism, we are more familiar with the idea that Impressionism and light has to do with landscape and has to do with the environment, the world around us, and the idea that Impressionism color theory is based on the spectrum, on the idea that white light is, of course, not white, that it is made up of all the colors of the rainbow. And your job as an artist, as a painter, is to study that spectrum, is to study the world, to see what color is that sky, what color is that grass, what color, and how many different colors are in it. That is not just blue, but it's a combination of blue and purple and red and green and whatever. That it's a way of studying the world, new observations, and trying to get on your canvas a new way of looking at that. And it is individual, that because of your experience, because sight is based on your assumptions and your experience, you then would have your own unique way of seeing, of studying those colors and putting together that painting. There's a wonderful article written by Will Lowe, who was an American Impressionist painter, spent a lot of time at Giverny, was a good friend of Theodore Robinson, and the Americans who were there. And he really emphasized the idea that people were looking, studying. Their conversation, he said, was largely technical. Color values, vibration, decomposition of tones, the orange light and the purple shadow. This is what people talked about, the painters at Giverny who had come to study under Monet. And the idea was that nature should be seen through an individual temperament, that it should be unique. And in fact, Monet, he quotes Monet as having a confrontation with one of these landscape painters who came to study with him and in this school, who had done a landscape, and Monet looks at it and he says, "Is this the way you see nature?" And the young student says, "Oh yes, that is exactly the way I see nature." And he said, and Monet says, "Impossible, for that is the way I see nature." So, it's difficult. Obviously he felt that the student was a little too close to his own style, and it should be individual. But in fact, and I'm just gonna, so some of you will remember this is from a year ago. Okay, how many people see white and gold? How many people see blue and black? Okay. Those of you who don't, do you remember the whole controversy about this? That this picture, this is of a real dress, and there are other pictures that show us what the actual color of the dress is. But people look at it and they see a particular set of colors. They either see white and gold or they see the dress as blue and black. And fights have broken out over this. It is so, if you see it one way, you absolutely cannot understand why anybody else would see it another way. And you know what color it really is? Do you remember? It's actually blue and black, even though more people see it as white and gold. But this picture, there's something about this picture that makes, other pictures, it looks perfectly well, blue and black, but there's something about this. So, clearly we do see differently. It is individual. It is about us and not necessarily about a universal principle. And the idea that we are in control of this was of course, studied intensively by physicists at the time who were very interested in color and light and how we perceive it. Ogden Rood was one of them, an American taught at Columbia, who had actually studied as a painter in the Munich school when he was younger. So he wrote this particular book, Modern Chromatics, for painters to try to help them understand what was going on with color and light and paint, because it's a very confusing and very difficult kind of relationship among them. Rood helped them, though, because what you see is light. And even in a physics lab, light is usually experimented with or color is experimented with in the form of light, different colored lights. So what do you do with paint? Because if you mix colored lights, you get one tone, one mixture, like, yellow and blue will make green. But that doesn't necessarily happen with paint. So how do painters use these scientific discoveries on the palette? And so what Rude said that helped a lot, or at least it changed the course of painting history, he said, well, you know, paint is light. I mean, paint is paint, it's a physical thing, but we see it as light, just like we see that hat as light, or just like we see that tree as light. We see blue paint as light. So if you're mixing two colored lights together, two separate colored lights, and they create yellow and blue will create green, that's what you need to do with paint. Yellow paint, blue paint. And the eye will mix them as green. Sound familiar? Neo-Impressionism. To a certain extent, Monet and his followers, they certainly knew Rude's work. It was translated into French in 1881. So it wasn't just Americans who knew it, the French also. And Seurat was the one who was sort of the leader in Neo-Impressionist theory. And of course, you know, his idea was directly out of Rude, to take the paint and put different colors side by side in order to create the mixtures. And he's putting together and claiming a relationship to the world as a scientist, that he is making new observations that will help us understand reality. The idea that color, light, painting, and thinking about looking is a matter of study, of science, of knowledge, is what I'm thinking about thinking, partly behind what Mary Cassatt did with her Modern Woman mural. And I'm sorry, you know, it's hard to really show this. And we, of course, it no longer exists, or we don't know where it is. And so we only have the black and white photographs that were taken of it at the time. But if you look at it, the center part of it with Seurat's painting, and I'm showing you a related painting that she did at the time so that you can see what the colors originally would have been. You can see that there's a very strong color resemblance to Seurat, and also that sense of the figures being sort of eternal, as Seurat had made geometric forms out of the people that he was observing. Cassatt, not to that extent, but to the same degree, creates this very ideal, simplified world where the figures seem to be sculptures, seem to be the underlying universal interpretation of these women in nature. She also seems like she read Rude, although we don't have any documentary evidence of that. But one thing that Rude did talk about, in addition to his great idea that little dots of paint are lights, was that there's a difference between painting, a canvas on an easel that go on a wall, and a mural, what he calls a decoration. That in painting, you have a certain kind of color. But if it's on a wall, then luminous colors are arranged on a flat surface. And he said, it is evident that the positions occupied by color in decoration and in painting are essentially different. Color being used in the latter, that is in painting, primarily as the means of accomplishing an end, while in decoration, it constitutes to a much greater degree the end itself. Color, so this is the germ of modernist thinking about painting and about color, that it is the end in and of itself. And it is the flat surface, the color, flat area of a color on a flat surface that we are so familiar with as the basis for so many 20th century schools, including Matisse, Picasso, Cubism, et cetera, up to the present day. And when you compare Cassatt's works, these are not the mural itself, but based on the mural done around the time of the mural, the paintings and the prints are very flat, have that element of decoration, of color for the sake of color. Compared to, for instance, Theodore Robinson, who is a classic impressionist, but his paint is giving us the world itself. It's paint or color as a means to an end. Okay. Now, inner thoughts. All of these women don't really seem to be looking at something in the outside world. Crocheting, reading, even raising the cup of tea. These are women who are looking at something, but well, if you've ever crocheted or knitted or done any handwork, if you read, okay, you're looking at words, but it's all going on in your mind. This idea that what's going on in your mind can be portrayed by the environment, in this case flowers, was something that symbolist artists, particularly Redon, but others as well, picked up on. And of course, we associate these flower portraits of Redon with this concept. But look how late this is. This is 1910. Redon's work in this vein really doesn't happen until after 1900, whereas Cassatt was doing it as early as the late 1870s. A painting like this one. Here she is. Again, this is a social situation. She's inside of a Paris apartment and she has a hat on. So she's a visitor. She's come from somewhere else. And I posit that that is not her dog, because if she were walking that dog, she would not have it on her white skirt. No way. No way. This dog had to have been inside, had to have clean feet in order for her to have it on her. But look at her. What is she thinking? She's in a social situation, but she is even more so than any of the other women that we've looked at in these social events. She is completely in her own mind. And around her is the view of Paris. I'm thinking that this is her apartment looked up over a park up to Sacré-Cœur, the hill upon which Sacré-Cœur Montmartre was built. And perhaps it was being built at this time. I don't know. This looks like construction to me. But so around her head is this, it's like her thoughts are flying out the window. And the hat, oh my God. I mean, talk about flowing, talk about, the veils, talk about how we might imagine thinking her thoughts are represented outwardly by the hat and the landscape behind. In the Impressionist exhibition, the 8th Impressionist exhibition of 1886, Seurat was featured, Neo-Impressionism, and Redon was featured. Redon had been taken up by the Impressionists, had been included in their group. And this is the kind of thing he showed. The one on the left probably not this particular one, but something similar, The Temptation. Black and white, this is what he was doing in the 1870s and 1880s. He was mainly a printmaker and charcoal artist, drawing artist rather than a painter. Look at the one on the right, Profile of Light. These are now what would be sort of the basis of the symbolist movement and the idea of looking inward, the thoughts that are you're seeing and looking perhaps, but with your mind's eye. Redon was made famous by Huysmans, J.K. Huysmans, who wrote a bestseller at the time in 1884 in Paris called A Rebours, which is usually translated into English as Against the Grain, which features a French nobleman who tires of the world, tires of the decadence of the world and the life that he's lived. He goes to his country home and shuts himself in. So this novel was immediately recognized as breaking with the realist tradition. Because, of course, realism is all about the outside world, is all about your interest, new observations, scientific inquiry, exploration of the outside world. Symbolism, on the other hand, focuses on what's inside you. And the Cassatt, the hero of the book, collects Redon prints and drawings. So that's the connection. Okay, this is the course part of it. There will be a quiz again. So you can basically see, you can look this up yourself, but subjectivity rather than realism. And that's what they mean, that it's not an observation of the outside world, but an exploration of emotions, feelings, and subjectivity. The artist's power to reveal truth rather than the scientist's power to reveal truth. That is the idea of a scientific inquiry. The occult, the morbid, the dream world, melancholy, evil, and death. Nuance and suggestion. And finally, internationalism down here, which is true not only of the widespread interest in this movement, but in the sources that symbolist artists drew upon. This is the time, 1 year later after A Rebours was published, Sigmund Freud was in Paris. He got a year's scholarship to study with Jean-Martin Charcot, whose workshop is depicted in this painting down here, or his lecture hall. Charcot was a French psychologist who was trying to study the inner workings of the mind, and his way of getting at those inner workings was through hypnotism, which is what's happening here. Of course, he was always only hypnotizing women, right? You know, you gotta wonder. But whatever. And so Freud's here in Paris with Charcot, studying with Charcot, and this becomes the basis for what would eventually be his own method of getting at the inner workings of the mind through psychoanalysis. But his first book, of course, The Interpretation of Dreams, was all part and parcel of the idea of how we get to what's inside of us. And this is the context for the work that we first started with. 1890, by 1890, symbolism had really pervaded literature and the arts. Each of these artists that we know as post-impressionists taking a different tack, using it in a different way. Cassatt, of course, was always interested in looking and thinking now, even though she's got the hat, so she's also a visitor. She is completely not paying attention. She's there, but she is not there. She is, somewhere else entirely in this social situation. And she also, at this time, is drawing on other traditions, particularly, of course, Japanese prints. And I just want to point out that the Western artists in the 19th century were looking at Japanese prints as more abstract and in many ways representing a different kind of assumption, spiritual assumption of what human beings are, and particularly the faces being inscrutable, right? Stereotypical interpretation of Asian traditions. But I just want to point out that when Mary Cassatt does her sort of reinterpretation of Japanese prints, when she has a woman who's doing her hair in front of a mirror, she's not even looking at the mirror. I mean, she is so lost in her own thoughts that she's not even, unlike this woman who is looking in the mirror, this woman, Mary Cassatt's woman, is completely in another world. These are the Japanese prints. I don't know if you've ever seen them up. They're not up often or out often, but they are owned by the MFA. There are 4 of them. There's 3 of the 4. And at some point, you may get a chance to see them. And this is the set of 10 that Cassatt exhibited in 1891, partially based on her study of Japanese prints and the idea that, again, these works are decorative and the color is flat and there for itself. So other artists like Redon, getting back to Redon, drew from other non-Western traditions or non-modern traditions, non-Renaissance traditions. He was interested in Buddhism and did a series of works on the Buddha. I don't know if you can see where the Buddha is in this one. Here's his head. He's kind of subsumed into this tree, but here he's kneeling and facing this way. And anyway, so artists typically going to other spiritual traditions to find a new way of understanding not the external world, but the internal world. Gauguin, particularly Gauguin and Cassatt, were friends. Gauguin had one of Cassatt's works. And by the late 1880s, Gauguin is reinterpreting Christian Catholic works, his self-portrait and the head of Christ. And when he goes to Tahiti, draws and learns as much as he can about Polynesian spiritual traditions, but melding them with his own Western traditions. So this is the context for the mother and child subject. It is completely within this realm of exploring other traditions, going back and reinterpreting particularly Catholic themes. That this is a period, the 19th century, of anti-church activity. Schools, for instance, in France are being separated out from the church and a public school system is instituted. So there's a general desire to reinterpret what was good about the tradition of the church, but reinterpreted in a modern way. When Cassatt exhibited the 10 color prints, she exhibited also 4 of these mother and child pastels and paintings. She, again, was one of many, many artists who were reinterpreting this theme, including, of course, many French, but also many Americans. And you can see that there is a similarity among them, reinterpreting, using ordinary plates or hats to represent halos, having Mary be in a garden. But Cassatt's work, Cassatt's mother and child interpretation typically has that deep sense of contemplation, of looking inward, and not just on the part of the adult, the woman in these subjects, also on the part of the child. There's a sense that both of them, independently and together, are participating, are thinking, are contemplating, are existing in a deeper spiritual world. Cassatt also, in addition to studying Japanese prints, also, of course, studied pre-Renaissance Italian Madonnas and Child. This is one that she helped Louisine Havemeyer get for the Havemeyer collection, which is now in the Met. But in addition to drawing on these sources, Cassatt was also interested in the movement of spiritualism that became extremely popular in the late 19th century and early 20th century. She was trying to find ways to cross boundaries. And she participated in seances, partly because she was hoping, and this was part of the literature about spiritualism, or about spiritualism and seances, that if you put yourself into this otherworldly frame of mind, you could actually get to a place, not a physical place, obviously, but some spiritual place where time is transcended and normal life and death are transcended. And you could communicate, and this is what everyone has heard about spiritualism and seances, communicate with those souls who have already died, who have crossed that border, have gone to the other side. And the images, the mothers and children that she created that have that deep sense of contemplation do appear to be contemplating something so out of time, so beyond the normal human life, that you can see how she would be interested in the idea of immortality, of a place where you don't lose your life. She was a fan of William James, particularly, who himself participated in seances. This is an undated photograph of him in a seance. He died in 1910, so it's probably around 1905 or so. And Cassatt was interested, even referred friends of hers to William James, people who lived in the area, who were interested in trying to participate in seances, learn more about spiritualism, and again, to communicate with the dead, strange as it may sound. But it is the idea of immortality is not so unusual for an artist. We've looked at women looking as possible self-portraits of Cassatt as an artist, a metaphor for an artist who looks, an artist who observes, who notices, who judges what's going on around her. And now these people, these mothers, these children who are in a world of contemplation, who perhaps are in a place of immortality, a place where the normal life and death of a human is transcended. And that, of course, is the definition of a museum. Theoretically, if you can get your work into a museum, if you can be selected, it's not only a tremendous honor, especially during your lifetime, but it is a promise. It may not be kept, but it is a promise of immortality, that those works will be preserved and they will be shown generation after generation, century after century. And so I'm showing you here some of the earliest works of Mary Cassatt's that entered museums, and of course all during her lifetime. The Musée d'Orsay, actually the Luxembourg, as it was at the time, acquired the first work. This was the first work of hers to enter into a museum, although they had tried to get a work of hers earlier. This time they were successful. Her alma mater, which is the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, acquired this work in 1904. The Detroit Art Institute, or Institute of Arts, acquired this work in 1908. And you'll notice they are the mother and child works. However, by 1910, it's not just the mother and child works that are being acquired by museums, but it is also the women looking deep in thought. These are the women who, yes, are observing the world around them, are looking out, but they are also participating in thought and transcending, hopefully, normal human life and death. And that is what Cassatt wanted for herself. In 1910, after these significant museum acquisitions had been made, she wrote to her friend Louisine Havemeyer, "Perhaps they are right when they say I will survive. Who knows?" Thank you. Now, again, if you don't have questions, I will give a quiz.
So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you.
I was intrigued by a question that was asked 2 weeks ago at the end of the lecture, and it kept reoccurring to me as you spoke today. And that is the question about why, and you could see it very clearly when you showed the paintings and sketches that went into museums, the preponderance of collection was done by American museums. Why is that? Why was she not collected more on the European continent?
Well, she was. These are just museum acquisitions. There were, most of her work actually sold during her lifetime, at least within her Impressionist era, that is up until 1900, were collected by French collectors. And so it actually was hard to do an exhibition of Mary Cassatt in the States because so many of her works she didn't own them, and they were in French collections. And even today, I'm doing this exhibition for a museum in Paris and trying to get works, how hard it is to send works across the ocean, get works from European collections. And there are at least 30 in European museums right now, mostly museums that were the result of former private collections in Portugal, in Spain, in Germany, in Switzerland, in France. So I do think that after she did the Modern Woman mural in Chicago, that was sort of her debut, American debut, and then she had the exhibition in 1895. And after that, there were more exhibitions. Durand Ruel, her dealer, had a New York office. there were more American collectors, and Americans loved her. I mean, eventually. Not, she was a little little too progressive for a lot of collectors, but eventually, and particularly the mothers and children, those were very much admired by Americans. So I think eventually Americans just took over. And of course, they were collecting all the Impressionists. There are more Monets in American collections than in French. So go figure.
The next question is up in this corner.
I would wonder if you could comment a little bit about the direction of gaze. And
Where are you? Can you raise your hand? Oh, okay.
so much of what you see is a really intense gaze in some direction, even if it's inward. But not too often is it towards someone else. And yet sometimes, particularly among women who occupy a more social sphere often, I would not have wanted the woman. You comment on what was she thinking? Did she really say that? And I was thinking I would not have wanted her to look at me.
I know, right?
And think, did you really say that? And I noticed that the only time you began to see actual engagement of gaze was with the mother and child series, and not always even then.
Right.
More often they're looking somewhere else.
Right.
Somewhere else. But I'm wondering if there are other paintings, or can you comment? Turn that into a question. Comment on the direction of where they're looking and what that says.
Well, the only one I can think of offhand is this, the one that's in the Detroit Institute, where these women really do seem more so to be looking at each other and looking at the child. But in general, I do think she was after something much more eternal or non-located in a particular moment. So, I'm trying to think of other Impressionist works where people are actually looking at each other and talking, and I'm not thinking of too many in general. Even like the Degas, like the Milliners, or where they're two women side by side or doing something together, they're typically not looking at each other.
I think what I meant was that sometimes it's implied when they're looking outside the frame.
Right.
That sometimes they are looking inward, and sometimes there's a frame of reference, like in the Loge type of paintings.
Right.
I wonder whether you could comment. I've read a bit. We have the mother and child paintings, very positive emotion. But I've heard that Mary Cassatt herself was not a very nice person. I read an article by, I think it was a person who critiqued an exhibit that was held here at the MFA in the late 90s, I think it was. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Yes.
Could you comment on that at all?
Whether she was a nice person?
Well, I'm trying to juxtapose the mother and child, and very positive image we have of her, with comments that in reality she didn't get along with her sister-in-law Lois, her brother,
right.
The Pennsylvania Railroad president's wife, others that she was very kind of snippy. I'm just wondering if you could comment on this.
Well, okay. She, I think she was very particular, and she was an artist through and through. So she really only felt she could talk to people who understood art. And Louisine Havemeyer happened to be one of those people. Degas was another. Morisot, I think she had a decent relationship with Berthe Morisot, although they were rivals in many ways. But she couldn't talk to you about art in the way that she wanted to, which was, very sophisticated and grounded in the latest movements in Paris and all that sort of thing. She really had no no time for you. And she had one of those run-ins with Cecilia Beau. Do you know Cecilia Beau? Yeah, they met, and she wrote to, I think, to Louisiana Havemeyer and said, well, whatever you do, don't talk to her about art. So, but getting back to children, I think children really liked her. She was one of those people that really got along with kids. I think she treated them like adults. She was funny. She was very witty. And she could entertain them and get that, get a nice look on their faces. So, I think she she actually could relate to children more comfortably than if they were her own children. She didn't have to change their diapers or or discipline them or raise them to be good adults. All she had to do was entertain them for a little while, and she did that very well. So I think she was definitely her own person, and people don't always like that in a woman, right?
The next question is in the center back.
Is there any evidence that Mary Cassatt asked her subjects what they were thinking?
Is there any evidence? No.
Letters?
No, unfortunately. And a lot of it, there weren't actual tea parties going on. So they were just models. So they weren't actually reacting to anything that was actually happening. So when we see, the woman in the bonnet rolling her eyes, or what I consider rolling her eyes, Mary Cassatt had to have made that up. She had to have constructed that and maybe asked her model to look in a certain direction. Again, I think Mary Cassatt was looking, but she was more than that. She was thinking. She was constructing this composition. She was constructing the expression on the face and asking her models to do the best they could to portray what Cassatt wanted them to portray. And that, being a model is very difficult. She volunteered to be a model for Degas for some of the millinery paintings that he was doing because she got it. She got what he wanted. And she could get the expression on her face that he was interested in. And so, I have to think that she used certain models because they could do that. And her sister Lydia was one of them, who I think she could count on to, this is presumably Lydia down here in the pink. All these different expressions, subtly different, had to have been, sort of constructed by Cassatt to look a certain way. Maybe something she noticed in that model, but anyway.
In her selected letters, which I guess one volume that you have compiled, does she give explanations to friends of what we were just discussing, the tea party, the concept that she was trying to convey?
Alas, no.
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 Does she address any of the intellectual movements swirling around Paris
Yes.
during that time and how those kind of played into what she was trying to convey?
I wish. Wouldn't it be great if she said, oh yeah, I read Zola's Louvre and, I'm going to paint, just that thing. Unfortunately, she does refer to Zola. She does refer to authors, literature, history. She was a voracious reader. She loved Jane Austen. And she read William James. She knew Henry James. She met Edith Wharton, didn't like her. didn't like her books. So she does refer to all of these famous people in her letters, but she doesn't say, oh, and I tried to paint just like that, or to, represent a Tea Party the way Henry James would have written about it. We wish, but and she probably talked to, and her great friendship with Degas, I think, was based on stuff like that. That they talked about this, that this would have been something that they articulated, and the other artists around them, Bert Morrisson. They spent a lot of time together, and they talked about all these things. If we had a body of, the problem with Degas was he was in the same town. They didn't have occasion to write that down. And the people she wrote to back in the States wouldn't have known what she was talking about. So it's all in having the right correspondent in letters. The best letters in terms of art are between her and her young art student friends, Eliza Haldeman and Emily Sartain, when she really does talk a little bit about the models and about, what she was going through to get certain works done. But, right. I mean, we're lucky we have what we have in terms of letters and documentation.
Did Mary Cassatt ever explain explicitly why her subjects were exclusively women? Was it an affirmative choice? Was it an artistic choice or a political statement?
Again, we wish we had a statement like that. And they weren't exclusively women. I mean, she did paint a number of portraits of men. Her brother Alexander, she painted 5 times. Her father, she was commissioned to paint various portraits of French men, family friends. So I don't think she made a conscious choice that she was not going to paint men, but these were her subjects. And I know it may seem like she restricted herself to a very small array of topics, but when you see how each one of them is thought through individually and separately and with such nuance, you can see why she would do the same thing over and over again. I mean, it's like Monet painting those stupid haystacks. Didn't he get tired of it? Yeah, but there was always something that she was after, and she always wanted to be immortal. She always wanted to be a great artist and to live on in the museums. So, I think each time she thought, okay, I've got it. I've really got the inner quality. I've got the what's going to continue to interest people century after century after century, and it does. So, kudos to her.
I just have a really short question. When will that exhibit be in the Jacques Marandré?
In 2018, the spring of 2018.
Spring. That's
right,
my favorite museum.
Yes, right?
It's a beautiful museum.
Yeah. If you haven't been there, it's really worth it. And I hadn't been there in 30 years, so it's off the beaten track. Almost no Americans go there. It's very French, so you really feel like it's not like going to the Louvre where nobody French. You never hear French spoken.
Like early photography, people were very serious, didn't smile. It seems like, like you said, a lot of her paintings very contemplative, serious. And I'm not familiar with all her works. Is there any gaiety? Is there any Or was it the sign of the times that's the way people painted, were people more contemplative and serious?
Compared to, say, Renoir?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, she was definitely on the serious side. And she, you know the phrase, actually, Duranty writes about it a little bit, and Manet talks about it, that what she wanted to do was to create a great work of art, that the beauty of the subject was not essential. So she would deliberately hire models that were less attractive, if she could find them, because it was a challenge to her group to be able to take any subject. You know, again, you know this whole modernist relationship between the subject and the finished painting, that the subject in the end is not as important as what the artist makes of it to create a work that is itself sort of eternal and independent of life, not a mirror image of life. So yeah, that's what she was after. And when she told her mother, no, I'm not going to be a portraitist, I'm going to paint paintings, I'm going to do great works, I think that hence the seriousness, the ambition of her work.
Question up here in the back.
This relates more to the light, the philosophy, and the moving towards the abstract. So I just came back from Rome and Assisi. And
From where? I'm sorry.
From Rome and Assisi, where I.
Oh.
All right.
Yeah.
And when you were talking about, the flat wall,
right,
and the scientists talking about the way the light changes the paint,
right,
and I know those, these are not our kinds of paints. I mean, anyway, is there any? I didn't see it, but as they're moving, was there a study of the mosaics that have glass and light in them that are all created outside, and the frescoes that are all put on walls by the Impressionists, which I'm not aware of that study, or anything that you can tell us about that?
Well, the frescoes from Pompeii to medieval churches to Giotto, all of them were very avidly studied in this period. And one of the highest compliments, even in Cassatt's letters, is whether something looks like a fresco or not. That it's, that again, that kind of, here's a group of people who have grown up going to museums and traveling around Europe. They revere the art of the past, and it's a heavy burden because, they, again, especially thanks to photography, these works they're able to have them in their own collections of photographs and in illustrated books and whatever. So, they're always competing with the past. Puvis de Chavannes, for instance, or the Sargent murals, are all part of this attempt. And the mural movement, most public buildings, even in this country, were decorated with murals, all part of that interest in mosaics, frescoes, large-scale, what were called decorative works. And the Impressionists wrote about them and talked about decoration, about murals, but Cassatt was the only one who got a chance to do one. So her Modern Woman mural is very experimental, and she talked about how she would love to have Degas' opinion about it, because the two of them disagreed about what a decoration should be. And she said, but I can't invite him over at this point. He's going to say something awful, and I'll never recover in time to finish this. So, I mean, they were mean, and they were mean to each other. They were, even though they were the best of friends. But this whole group, I think, you have to see as being very acerbic, very witty, very challenging, very prodding of each other and other people. But yes, this monumental type of painting was extremely important to them.
I think we have time for one more question.
You said that there was really no tea party happening at the time.
What?
So was there really a teacup? Was that wallpaper?
That's a good question.
Was the couch, that beautiful couch, did she just create that as she was moving along in the painting?
Actually, you can recognize the same couch and the same armchair in a lot of different paintings. That is real. Or real-ish. Sometimes it's really hard to tell, but in fact, doesn't the MFA have the desk? Yeah, and the tea set, right. That tea set, the silver tea set. Yeah, so these things really did exist, and she really did own them. And right, yeah. So that was real, and she had, for the Modern Woman mural, she commissioned clothing for the models for that. So the clothes were real, the hats were real, but they were just in the studio or just in, and that's confusing because these paintings, for instance, the tea probably was done in her studio, not in her apartment, although it looks like her apartment. Some of these chairs might have been in the studio, but she had to have recreated her own apartment in the background rather than have the models sit in her living room. But we don't know. We're just guessing.
Thank you so much for joining us today.